Get started. It's a little
I'm
after
sorry.
9.
I thought there was only us three. I realized this now. Sorry. I'll shut up now.
Okay. All right. So, good morning, everybody. Today we are going to uh, solve the biggest problem of a belief in God. And after today, everything will be resolved and you'll all feel good. Or not. In any case, the biggest problem for most people believing in God, a good, just, kind God, is the idea that it seems that in the world, a lot of good people seem to suffer, and a lot of not so good people seem to do well. And how is it that that's allowed to happen? So that they actually have a term for that in Jewish, well, not Jewish, in general theology. It's called theodicy. I'm not exactly sure why it's called that. Theo, of course, comes from God. Odyssey sounds awfully Greek to me, like someone's going on a journey. But I guess that's not what it really is about. It's about this conflict of God. I should have looked it up before we started to talk today. But theodicy is the term that's used to describe this problem of why do bad things happen to good people if there is a just God who's in control of everything. So what I'm going to do today, again, I have a handout for everybody, and I'm going to put the handout up on the screen here in a second. Um, okay, here it is. Boom. Okay, there you are. So the problem can be basically summarized uh, with this diagram here that I put on the front page of our handout. There's a square here with four corners, and each corner represents a proposition, a truth statement. Right? God is good, God is all powerful, and something bad happens to a good person. And the problem is stated is that you can't hold all four corners of this square at the same time. That one of these corners has to leave. And if you take out one of the corners, you've solved the problem. So virtually all of the problems we're going to discuss today solve the problem by attacking one of these four propositions. Now, before I get on with the rest of it, the handouts that I have here, I forgot to include in the handout one Jewish source that seems to suggest maybe God is not good in a way. So that is the prophet Isaiah, who says God creates. We actually recite this verse in the early morning prayers. Yotzer or uvarei choshech. He fashions light and creates darkness. Osei shalom. He makes peace. Uvarei et hara. The original in Isaiah is, and he also creates evil. The rabbis were a little disturbed by the idea that God would create evil, and so when they put it into the prayer book, they quoted the verse, but they changed the last word. So now it doesn't say Ra, it says Hakol. So God creates everything, which was the real fundamental principle Isaiah was trying to say. Basically, there is only one God, one creator, one source of everything in the universe, and therefore, if something appears to be bad, that is also coming from God. That is, dualism, the belief that there's two divine beings, one good and one bad, does not explain why there's bad things in the world, because we are strict monotheists. Only one creative source. And so things that appear bad must be coming from that same unique creating source. That's what Isaiah was trying to say, and that's why the rabbis rephrased it. But it does seem to suggest, it's the only source I found in Jewish literature that would suggest maybe God isn't all good, right? If he's creating things that seem bad. I think perhaps it was really an attack on one of these other corners, but and you don't really see much about this. People generally don't want to say God isn't good, but dualists will attack this corner by saying there's two gods, one good and one bad, right? So that would solve the problem. So let's dispense with that corner for now and take a look at some of the other ones. Why do we have this problem? Why do we think it's a problem in the first place? Well, there is, first of all, in the Shema, right, which is 3 paragraphs from the Torah that we recite twice every day, the second paragraph of the Shema comes from Deuteronomy 11:13 to 21, And here's the text. Whoops. Here's the text for you in English. It will be if you hearken to my commandments that I command you this day to love your God and serve him with all your heart, with all your soul. I will bring the rain of your land at its time, the early rain, the later rain. You'll gather in your grain and wine and oil, and I'll give grass in your fields and your livestock, and you'll eat and be sated. But beware, lest your heart be misled and you turn away and worship strange gods and prostrate yourselves before them. Then the wrath of the Lord will be kindled against you. He'll close off the heavens. There'll be no rain. The ground won't give its produce. And you will perish quickly from the good land that God gives you. Okay. So, in other words, this is only one example. I chose it because it's an example that we're supposed to recite twice every day. But many examples in the book of Deuteronomy say if you follow God's laws, things will go well for you and you will live happy lives. If you don't follow God's laws, bad things will happen and you will be punished, right? So the Bible itself seems to say that good things will happen for good people and bad things will happen to bad people. And yet that's not really the world that we seem to live in. We don't always see that. Really good people suffer sometimes, and really bad people sometimes prosper and do quite well in this world. So there's a problem with this kind of simplistic theology, or what seems to be simplistic theology in the book of Deuteronomy and other places in the Bible. Psalm 37 gives a more nuanced approach. So Psalm 37 probably comes at a later time in history, and there's one verse in the Psalms that is recited if you do the grace after the meals in Jewish tradition. So you're supposed to say before you eat a meal, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, thank you God for bringing bread out of the ground, and then you eat your meal. It's a very short blessing to thank God, and then you eat. The grace after the meals, Birkat Hamazon, is a very lengthy, long prayer, many, many paragraphs. And sometimes people shorten it during the week. They tend to do a longer version, a more complete version on Shabbat. But in any case, if you do the complete long version at the very end of the grace after the meals, it quotes this verse the from the book of Psalms, from Psalm 37. And here it is in Hebrew. Na'ar hayiti v'gam zekanti v'lo ra'iti tzadik ne'ezav v'zaro mevakesh lachem, which means I was once young, na'ar hayiti, v'gam zakanti, and now I am old. V'lo ra'iti, I haven't seen a tzaddik, a righteous person, ne'ezav, abandoned. V'zaro, and his child, his offspring, mivakesh, seeking lechem, bread. I was once young and now I'm old, and I haven't seen a righteous person abandoned, and his children also begging for bread. Okay? By the way, this psalm is one of many psalms that are written in alphabetic order. Every second verse is the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So this is the Nun verse, Na'ar Hayiti. Many people, when they do Birkat Hamazon, oh wow, let me put speaker view here. Okay, there. Many people who do Birkat Hamazon say that verse when they're singing the Birkat Hamazon. They sing it softly, or maybe they skip it. And the reason they do that is because they don't feel that it represents the world they live in, right? We have seen good people begging for bread. We have seen good people that seem to be abandoned, and so we say it because it's in the prayer and it's in the Psalms, but maybe a little softly because we're not so sure. What I did when I studied the psalm in its whole, though, is what I would like to show now is that it's actually a little more nuanced than some people might think. So, in context, take a look at the boldface verses here that I've highlighted. Do not fret because of the wicked, nor be envious against evildoers, for they will soon be cut down like grass and wither like the green herb. Rest in the Lord, or trust in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Do not fret over him who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil schemes, for evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait upon the Lord will inherit the earth. For yet a little while, and the wicked shall not be. Though you look well at his place, he will not be there. Right? Um, so what is then you can look at the other verses as well, but what the point of the psalm is saying is, um, don't worry when it looks like things aren't working out for good people or when bad people seem to be prospering. Um, we live in human time, and I would say even more so today. With we were just talking before we started this program about the 24-hour day news cycle. The news, and of course, the news always likes to focus on negative things and repeats it over and over and over again. So that is human nature. First of all, to focus on the bad things, and second thing, to rehearse them over and over and over again, and be very impatient for things to work out. Right? We want things to work out now. So the psalmist, speaking before the 24-hour news cycle, is saying, relax. It looks bad right now, but things are going to work out. God's justice will prevail eventually. Okay? So what you need to do, human beings, is have God's perspective about time. We're looking at a very narrow, focused amount of time, and you really need to broaden your perspective, and you'll see that over time, things will work out. Let me go now to the verse itself. Na'ar hayiti v'gam zakanti. Why does he have to say at the beginning of the verse, I was once young and now I'm old? Right? The reason he's telling you that in the context of this psalm is this guy is maybe 70 years old. So he's seen a couple generations growing up. And yeah, I've seen righteous people abandoned. Who hasn't? What I haven't seen, he says, is righteous people abandoned and their children also suffering, right? So in the course of 10, 20 years, things may be bad, but 40, 50, 60 years, things will right themselves. They will fix themselves over time. One example that many people can relate to about that is, for instance, immigrants coming to this country. Um, and this is before the current Sturm und Drang, all the excitement about whether we should have immigrants, not immigrants, whatever. The normal immigrant experience to America is um, the first generation come here not so wealthy. They come here poor. They don't know the language. They don't have jobs. They eke out a living. They struggle. They suffer. They work really, really hard. And why do they do it? So that their children can get a good education, and their children grow up in the English language, and their children end up being acculturated and do much better. So that is a classic example of what the psalm is talking about. Righteous people who do suffer, but in order that their children won't be begging for bread, right? I mean, and so certainly that expresses a certain kind of reality in the world. However, I'm having said all of that, I'm not 100% comfortable with it. First of all, yes, sometimes things do work out over times, but sometimes they don't work out over time. And what about that? And so I'm not comfortable with this solution. It's a partial solution in some cases, but it's not a doesn't fix all the problems we see with unfairness in the world. The next three texts are all what I call the inscrutability doctrine. I don't know why I put them here at the beginning. One of these days I'll rearrange these sources. Um, so this is what I call in my theological quest the trump card, um, not referring to the president. So in other words, the wild card. Um, you have a deck of cards. The cards are different answers to this problem of why do bad people prosper and good people suffer, right? So we're going to play different cards one at a time to try and solve this problem. But in the deck, you also have the wild card. The wild card trumps everything, and that is we just don't understand God's ways. So they have three sources here in rabbinic literature that say we just don't understand God's ways. Um, but when we're playing this game, the game of trying to understand God, um, you want to play that card, in my opinion. You want to play the trump card at the very end of the game. because otherwise it's no fun. First of all, you don't really learn a lot, right? It's kind of like a scientist who says, "Well, I don't understand disease; it just is." Scientists don't say that. They say, "I don't understand disease, so I'm going to run some experiments to try and figure it out." Right? So same thing over here. You want to try and figure out as much as you can, and at the end of trying to figure out as much as you can then say, well, gee, the rest of it I still don't get, and then play your inscrutability trump card. Okay, so how does this card appear in rabbinic literature? So, so let's see, it's over here. Okay, in Brachot, that's a tractate of the Talmud, the first one in the Talmud dealing with blessings. Rabbi Yochanan says that Moses asked for three things, and God granted all three of them. The three things were the third thing that Moses asked for God was to be shown God's ways, that is, to understand how God works in the world. In other words, Moses was asking God, why does it look like the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? What made you create a world like that, right? So Rabbi Yochanan says Moses asked God for three things. The third thing was to understand why things don't seem to work out morally in the world. Moses said before him, Lord of the universe, why is it that some righteous men prosper and others are in adversity, and some wicked people prosper and others are in adversity? And then the Talmud gives us, in typical Talmudic fashion, gives various answers and then shoots them all down. So the first is you need to have perspective of time, right? So I won't go into details, but it's kind of like the Psalm 37 answer. So the objection to that in the Talmud is um, the righteous man who prospers is a righteous man, son of a righteous man, etc. But it's not so because um, uh, in Deuteronomy 24 it says, "Neither shall the children be put to death for their fathers." Right? And by the way, he just doesn't bother to quote Ezekiel, who says, "No longer will you say that the parents will eat sour grapes and the children's teeth uh, blunted." Right? Children should not be punished for the deeds of their parents. That's what Ezekiel said. So Moses is objecting to God. That's not what you said. You said it was going to be individual responsibility, not, it works out in the end, from generation to generation. So then the Talmud suggests a different answer. By the way, if I'm not clear somewhere, just raise a hand or something. So then the Talmud objects or proposes a second possible solution. Okay, nobody's perfect. You must therefore say, the Lord said to Moses, a righteous person who prospers is a perfectly righteous person. The righteous one who's in adversity, the one who suffers, is not a perfectly righteous person. He's suffering because is not a perfectly wicked person. There's some good in him. So his prospering is because he's good sometimes. The wicked man who's in adversity is a perfectly wicked person. Um, so that's one possible answer. I think it's not satisfactory because what bothers us is, of course, we know that nobody's perfect, but people who are generally much more kind, thoughtful, compassionate, caring, whatever, sometimes suffer a whole lot more than people who are obviously cruel, vindictive, mean-spirited, etc. So we can see with our own eyes, it's not really a just system, right? The scales don't really balance in comparison. So then finally the Talmud comes up with the reason I brought the text, the inscrutability doctrine, right? So the final answer of the Talmud is, this is in opposition to the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said only two requests were granted to him, and one was not granted to him, right? In other words, Rabbi Meir says Moses didn't get the answer to his third question, why do the righteous suffer? God left it mysterious. And he said to Moses, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, even though he doesn't deserve it, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy, even though he may not deserve it. Right? So basically, we can't ask God's ways. A much more simple source for this idea is from Pirkei Avot, Chapters of the Fathers, which is a tractate of wisdom sayings of the rabbis from the Mishnaic period. And here Rabbi Yanai says, it's not in our hands to explain the reason, either the security of the wicked or the afflictions of the righteous. We just don't know, right? I'm just going to cut to the chase. We don't know. um, and then there's the story in Kiddushin 39b. And, uh, and so I'm going to explain this one to you. You can read it, but you can see there's a lot of back and forth objections in the Talmud until they finally get to their conclusion. You can read it on your own. Let me just explain it because it'll be easier that way. It's a very clever story. Many of you may have heard it already. A father tells his son, I want to have eggs for breakfast, son. Go out and get us some eggs. So the kid goes outside, climbs a tree to a bird's nest, shoos the mother bird away from the nest, takes the eggs, and then on the way down from the tree, falls and breaks his neck and dies. Okay, why is this story significant? Because there are at least two commandments in the Torah that specifically state if you follow these commandments, you will have a long life. You will live a long, good life if you do these two things. One of them is found in the Ten Commandments. Honor your mother and father so that you should have a long life, right? And the other one is found in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, if you want to get eggs for breakfast, you need to shoo the mother bird away from the nest before you take her eggs. So she shouldn't see you stealing her eggs in front of her face, right? That's too traumatic, something too traumatic to do to a mother about her children. So shoo her away. She'll come back. She'll see the empty nest and be distraught, but it's not the same as seeing her eggs being stolen away. Shoo the mother bird away, and then you can take the eggs. And if you do this, it says in Deuteronomy, you will have a long life. Okay, so the story is this son is honoring his mother and his father because his father asked him to get eggs, and he shoos the mother bird away from the nest before he takes the eggs, thereby fulfilling in one act both commandments that promise a long life, and according to the Talmud, he then falls, breaks his neck, and dies immediately, right? Something's wrong with this picture, the Talmud's screaming, right? This is not the world the way the Torah promised it was supposed to be. So the objections in the Talmud, just to summarize some of them, one of the objections is, you just made that story up, right? You can't refute the Torah with a hypothetical that never happened. So the answer to that is, no, the rabbi so-and-so saw this very event happen. So somebody actually saw this happen. So then they say, well, maybe the kid, following what we read in one of the earlier sources, maybe he wasn't a perfectly good person. Maybe the kid was committing a crime while he was, some other crime while he was doing this. He was thinking bad thoughts while he was shooing the mother bird away. And the Talmud answers, what do you mean thinking bad thoughts? In Judaism, you don't get punished for thinking bad thoughts. You only get punished for doing bad things. So if he's thinking bad thoughts, who cares? He's doing two commandments. He should get his reward, right? So then the Talmud's answer to that objection is, there is one commandment that you actually can commit just by thinking about it. And that one commandment is idolatry, and it's a pretty serious one. So the idea is, while he was climbing the tree and shooing the mother bird away, he was praying to Zeus. Oh, Zeus, help me get these eggs from the tree. To which the Talmud answers, are you out of your mind? The kid is observing two commandments from the Torah. What makes you think he was thinking about Zeus at the time he's doing that, right? So they refute that idea. Anyway, they come down to finally two possible answers, okay? One answer is one that we'll come back to a little bit later, and that is he was climbing a rickety ladder. And it doesn't matter what commandments you're observing or how pious you are, you don't do reckless things and expect God to protect you. He was doing something extremely reckless. He was bound to have, he can't expect God to protect him just because he's fulfilling these two commandments. There was a rickety ladder. And that's an answer I'm going to come back to a little bit later. But the other answer that's given in this story is the rewards that are found in the Torah, including a long life, are not referring to this world. They're referring to the afterworld. So when is he going to get a long life? In the life that's completely long, the endless life, the life of the world to come, right? He will get his reward in the world to come. And so here is one of the classic rabbinic answers to the problem. Why do the righteous suffer? Doesn't matter, because in the end, they will get a reward in the afterlife, and they'll be commensurate with how good they were. Why do the wicked prosper? Doesn't matter, because in the end, they will get some kind of punishment in the afterlife that will be commensurate with their evil deeds. Now, the afterlife is the subject of next week's talk, so I'm going to discuss that later. But that is a possible solution to this problem, that whatever happens in this world, it's not nearly as important as what happens later. By the way, the handout link is in the chat box if you want to get it, just so you know. Okay, so that's that solution over there. So perhaps the answer comes in the afterlife. Let's go back to our outline here. Boom. Okay. So we had three inscrutabilities. One, two, three. Oh, yeah, Menachot. I didn't give you the text for this one. We read this one when we talked about how does God speak to people and continuing revelation. You may remember the story. Moses goes into Rabbi Akiva's study hall and he's sitting in the back seat, and Rabbi Akiva is expounding all these matters of Jewish law. Moses is totally confused. He doesn't understand what's going on. And then Rabbi Akiva says, well, this is something I learned from Moses at Mount Sinai, and Moses feels better. And I left the story there because that's all that was relevant to talking about continuing revelation, that the rabbis believed they were inspired to interpret the Bible in ways that even Moses may not understand, but that God certainly would approve of. But the rest of the story goes on to say, Moses then asked God, wow, you've got a guy like this, you gave the Torah to me. Can you show me what reward he got for being such a pious, righteous, scholarly sage? And then God shows Rabbi Akiva being tortured to death. So for those who don't know the history, Rabbi Akiva supported Bar Kokhba, who believed he was the Messiah, in a second revolt against Rome after the temple was destroyed. We mounted a second revolt against Rome about 50, 60 years later. And Rabbi Akiva, I guess 50 years later, Rabbi Akiva supported his revolt, and because he supported the revolt, when he was caught, the Romans tortured him to death. So Moses is shown Akiva's reward, so to speak, for being such a pious scholar. And then Moses turns to God and says, this is the Torah and this is its reward. This is how you reward your scholars and sages. And the answer given in the Talmud is silence. Don't bother me. This is just my decree. Basically, that's what God says to Moses. Obviously, it comes from a certain bitterness of whoever wrote the story. That really pious people suffer, and we just can't question God somehow. So that's an ultimate inscrutability issue. It's discussed in, as I mentioned here, in the Louis Jacobs article. That's part of the material. A pretty tough passage to read in terms of this particular issue. Okay, so the Talmud Kiddushin passage talks about the next life, or don't rely on miracles. And the next few things in the handout are summary articles. They're all from My Jewish Learning, which is a great website if you haven't seen it before. Has a lot of really great information about Judaism and Jewish beliefs and Jewish people. And so I've collected here five or four? Four articles from My Jewish Learning that sort of track the history and development of Jewish responses to suffering. So the first one's by Louis Jacobs, Biblical and Rabbinic Responses to Suffering. So in biblical times and then in rabbinic commentary what do we learn about the response to suffering? David Kramer, my Talmud teacher from the Jewish Theological Seminary, one of my Talmud teachers, wrote the article about medieval responses to suffering. So this is from the Middle Ages, Jewish philosophers of the Middle Ages. Or Rose, a conservative rabbi, wrote the article on the Holocaust, right? The ultimate, for our generation, event of evil in the world. How do we respond to the Holocaust? How do we try to make sense out of that? And finally, Harold Kushner's piece from his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, a sort of a modern approach to trying to resolve the problem of evil in the world. Harold Kushner, this was his first book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and he just a little background about him. He had a son who had progeria, which is a genetic disease that causes children to age prematurely and die at a young age. So Harold Kushner had a son who had progeria, aged early, died, and he watched all this happen in real time. It profoundly affected him and was the source of his writing his first book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. You know, he could not accept the idea that God wants righteous people, good people like his son to suffer this way, that there must be some other explanation. His book is not, he talks about the fact that he didn't title his book Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, because he doesn't want to answer that question. His source of faith, his source of belief, and that's something I'll expand on here, is God is found in how we respond to tragedy in the world, how we ascribe meaning, and what we do in our lives to try and prevent tragedy and to ameliorate suffering in the world. That's where God is found. And so his book is When Bad Things Happen to Good People, you know, how do we understand it and what do we do about it, right? So that's the name of his book. And my approach is going to be very similar to Harold Kushner's approach. So, in any case, his article there in the My Jewish Learning is a summary of that. Now, there is a question in the chat. Um, Theo is Greek for God, DK, Greek for justice. Oh, thank you very much, Simone. Thank you. Right. Right. So, Theodice, right? Theodice, right? Theodice is French, right? Very good. Right? God's justice, right? So there it is. Okay. Uh, okay. So let's go back to looking at. So those are the articles. I'll let you read those articles. They're fairly short, and they kind of summarize the development of Jewish thinking about the problem of evil. What I want to return to is two or three, I guess, passages in Maimonides. You know, again, my sort of general hero, although everybody has their shortcomings, but he has a lot of interesting things to say, and from the 12th century, pretty good. Um, so these first two are summary explanations of Maimonides from Wikipedia. Um, they're summarizing his Guide for the Perplexed, not a book I recommend reading itself, the translation of the Guide for the Perplexed. Let me say a few words about that first. So the Guide for the Perplexed is a great book. Maimonides wrote it for people who lived in his time, who had studied philosophy and science and medicine like he had, and also studied Jewish sources, and were having trouble reconciling science and religion, right? Sound familiar? So this is an age-old problem. In the 12th century, he was dealing with this issue. But he says in his introduction, to the book, several things that are kind of clever. He says, first of all, when people write books, particularly long books like this one, there seem to be errors and mistakes that creep into the text of the book. You know, something wasn't copied correctly, or the person who was writing it hadn't thought through his thoughts very well, So he says something on page 3 that contradicts something on page 20, and he didn't realize he was contradicting himself. Or, or there's something that is intentionally not clear, or something that seems out of order, or other kinds of mistakes that appear in long books. And then he writes, he writes, you will find none of those errors in this book. And then he says, if you think you found one of those errors, you have not understood me correctly. Go back and read it again. He also says in his book, I'm writing this only for people who have studied philosophy and science and also religion and are having trouble reconciling them. If you haven't studied philosophy and science, this book is going to bother you. Don't bother reading it. And he makes a few other comments like that, which indicate to many Maimonides scholars that what he was intentionally doing in writing the book, Guide for the Perplexed, was writing it in a way that the average person would not understand what he was trying to say, because he did not want them to understand what he wanted them to say, because he knew it would upset them. That is, people who have a simplistic view of God and how God works in the world will be disturbed by his more philosophical approach. But that also means it's a very hard book to read, and particularly without somebody having put the pieces together for you. So if you're interested, here I'll type in the let me type into the comments over here. I'm not sure why I didn't put this in the handout, but a suggested reading. So there's a book by Kenneth Seeskin on Maimonides' Guide. Okay, you can Google that on Amazon, or go to Amazon.com, and you'll see Kenneth Seeskin's book. I think it's called Guide for Today's Perplexed or something like that. And Kenneth Seeskin has been a very short book, kind of summarized Maimonides' thinking in a way that modern people can understand, right? So that's the first book. And the second book is one I think I recommended last week, which is by Mika Goodman, Maimonides and the Book That Changed, I think it's Judaism. So that's also now in the chat box. You can, again, if you go to Amazon.com and you look up Mika Goodman, there's a couple books there. One of them is on Maimonides. That's the book. Mika Goodman studied philosophy and Maimonides very thoroughly. He's a really smart guy in Israel. He lived here in America for quite a while, so he writes well in English also. He writes in Hebrew and in English. And he summarizes Maimonides' thinking not only on Revelation, which we talked about last time, but about why bad things happen to good people too. So those are two good sources if you want to read about Maimonides. I don't recommend reading the Guide for the Perplexed itself. Okay, let's go back to the outline then. So that's why I'm giving you here this summary of the guide from Wikipedia, which kind of explains Maimonides' thinking. Normally I do this on a chalkboard. I haven't figured out how to do it. I know you can do that on Zoom, but I haven't figured out quite how to do that. So just do an imaginary chalkboard in your head. So Maimonides explains evil by saying that first, evil is the absence of good. This was kind of a Greek idea, I think, originally. Right? Everything that's good in the world comes from God. The rest of it is just the absence of good. Another way to say that might be to say that, remember, the world was created out of unformed chaos and scattered, unorganized matter, and the process of creation was organizing matter. So now that the world is organized, there's still some chaotic elements to it that are still there, sort of, that are not organized and structured, right? That's not God. That's just kind of the nature of matter, as it were. So that's, I think, kind of what he's saying over here. God didn't create a thing called evil. Rather, God created good, and evil is something that exists when good is absent. That's expressed sometimes in Jewish literature by saying God hides his face, right? When God hides his face, bad things happen. And then we ask God to show his face so that the order will be restored in the universe. In any case, that's the first thing that Maimonides points out. God therefore created only the good things and not the bad things. The bad things are just there because the nature of the universe is matter, and matter is not necessarily good. Maimonides also contests the common view that evil outweighs the good in the world. He already pointed out what we know today, that human beings tend to focus on what's wrong. You know, there's a certain kind of person who walks into a room and the first thing they notice is a ceiling tile that's kind of crooked. Everything else about the room could be fantastic, but they notice the one thing that's slightly out of place. And that's an exaggerated form of what many human beings, including me, have, which is we tend to see things that are wrong and we don't see the 99.9% of things that are amazing and wonderful in the world. So the first thing is human perspective is skewed in how we look at the world, right? Every breath we take is a miracle. The fact that we have food to eat is a miracle. The fact that we have people who love us is a miracle, right? All these amazing miracles that are with us every day, morning, noon, and night, we forget about, we take for granted, and then we complain about whatever, I stubbed my toe. The world is coming to an end. Okay, so I'm a little bit exaggerating, but that's kind of the idea. The amount of good enormously outweighs the evil. Um, if you look at the whole universe, good is significantly more common than evil. That's again from the guide. He reasons this because man is very lowly compared to the rest of the universe, right? We're just little specks of matter in a one ball on a planet, and he didn't realize how insignificant we are in the universe. But we know better how insignificant we are in the whole universe. So look, what kind of bad things are going on compared to the magnificence of the rest of the universe that God created? We also tend to focus only on ourselves, not taking into account the entirety of the universe, which is overwhelmingly good since it contains all of life and all of the heavens. Then Maimonides, so the first thing is he tries to put things in perspective. Good tremendously outweighs evil. Second move he makes is, now let's talk about the bad things. The bad things we can can segregate into three categories. Evil that's caused by nature, hurricanes, earthquakes, viruses, and evil that people bring on others, war, crime, theft, those kinds of things, and then evil brought upon ourselves, right? The person who smokes 10 packs of cigarettes a day and then gets lung cancer and says, why did God give me lung cancer? Well, this is some things people do that they bring on themselves, right? If you have high cholesterol, then you should take some action to try and reduce your cholesterol, right? You do things to yourself that you can also fix yourself. And Maimonides says the most common kind of evil is the one that we do to ourselves. If we controlled ourselves more, a lot of the stuff that happens to us would be better. That's what he suggests anyway. The most common kind of evil is this. The second most kind of evil is what other people do to us, or what people do to others. And the least kind of evil in the world is the one that God causes. Or not God, but nature. Evil that's caused in nature. So the worst type of evil Maimonides reconciles as being very rare, but at the same time necessary for the survival of species. If man does not change and old generations do not die to make space for new generations, then man cannot exist in its ultimate form, right? So the ultimate evil, right, what we really, really fear most in the world is dying. That's the ultimate evil, is we're not going to live forever, so to speak. But then Maimonides points out, yeah, but if we live forever, we really wouldn't be human. And what would our kids do, right? If a man does not change and old generations do not die to make space for new generations, man cannot exist in its ultimate form. What makes us want to get up in the morning and do something is the knowledge that we have a limited amount of time to do the things we want to get done. I forgot, there's a poem by an Israeli poet, I think it's Yehuda Amichai, which speculates on the what would happen if we live forever, and you don't finish a project today, it's okay. You'll finish it 300 years from now. You love somebody and then you break up. It's okay. A couple hundred years later, you can fall in love again. uh, you know, and life is kind of meaningless. Nothing means anything because forever is forever. Um, so Maimonides says, look, things that happen in the world need to happen so that we are motivated to be fully human. By the way, there's a Star Trek version of that for people who like Star Trek. um, uh, Gosh, I don't remember the episode now. The original Star Trek, where they come to a planet that looks like it's all ideal and whatever, and Captain Kirk kind of says, "But this isn't what it means to be human. You have to have challenges to overcome in life. That's part of what it means to be human." So anyway, so Maimonides said that a few hundred years earlier. In any case, so that's. I just heard a lecture, by the way, by a microbiologist, or maybe he's a medical researcher, who explained the need for viruses. That viruses are kind of a genetic necessity for life to grow and develop. To in the multiple forms that they did in the planet. If it wasn't for the work of viruses, they wouldn't have these kinds of changes. Now, I'm not a geneticist, so I don't understand that exactly, but um, that's what he said. I can explain a little bit better the earthquakes because I used to live in Los Angeles. Um, Earthquakes are caused, by the tectonic plates that grind against each other, right? So the world is actually these plates of land that are floating on the molten mass of the core, and they as they float, they come in contact with each other and grind against each other, and that causes earthquakes. And from that also, the up kind of earthquakes cause mountains. Um, so first of all, if you like mountains and you like skiing, don't complain about earthquakes because we wouldn't have mountains and skiing if we didn't have earthquakes. Um, but aside from that, I also saw from this National Geographic episode, or maybe it was History Channel, um, the tectonic plates also help regulate the temperature of the planet and the atmosphere. And if it wasn't for the tectonic plates, the atmosphere wouldn't be just perfect for life to form. So again, God's universe is created so magnificently. All these unbelievable things are just precisely the way they need to be for life to exist on the planet. But yeah, they also cause earthquakes. And if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, the earthquake is bad for you. But generally speaking, it's just an earthquake. It's just two tectonic plates grinding against each other. And it's not really a bad thing per se. Daniel, why don't you ask the question since you have a hand raised?
if you've got the time. Um, so I have heard a philosophy that says basically the Messiah won't come, meaning world peace, until we all obey the commandments. So the question of
Unless we all what?
unless we all obey the commandments, in other words, if
Oh,
so what that means is that asking why do good things or bad things happen to good or bad people is the wrong question. I have free choice. Everyone does. If I make a bad decision that causes pain to others or suffering,
right,
that person does something bad. So
right.
we are
So
all entered. It's almost a Buddhist kind of philosophy.
right,
What do
yes,
you
and
think?
that's sort of the direction I'm going to go here. I just
Okay.
was dealing first with the natural problems, but now let's talk about the evil type of things that we human beings do ourselves. So yeah, so the second type of evil is relatively rare, and that humanity brings on itself. Um, um, the third type of evil humans bring upon themselves, right? So he says that the kind of evil where one human being beats up another human being or causes harm to another human is relatively rare. I think relatively compared to the third type, not compared to the first type. And it's right now seems to be pretty common, right? With a lot of people out there hating on each other. Um, so not so rare in our world right now, sadly. But the third type of evil human beings bring upon themselves and are the source of most of the ills of the world. We're victims of our own physical desires. To prevent the majority of evil which stems from harm we do to ourselves, we must learn how to ignore our bodily urges. Not ignore, but control, let's say, our bodily urges. Okay, so that's the one Wikipedia article. Um, Before I get back to Daniel's point, let me just bring this uh, second source from Maimonides, which I learned from one of my teachers many, many years ago. It's an interesting passage in Maimonides. So, it's all the way at the end of the handout here. So Maimonides he wrote three major works. The Guide for the Perplexed, which again, I'm not recommending you read. I recommend reading one of the other two books about it. He wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, not the Talmud, interestingly. He wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. And in that commentary on the Mishnah is a section we're going to read the last session of this class, where he talks about his belief in the afterlife. Because he was a philosopher, he introduced philosophy in all of these three sources. Um, and the third thing he wrote, and the thing he is most popular for, I'd say, certainly in the Orthodox world, but in Jewish learning, is his Mishneh Torah, which is his code of Jewish law. So the Talmud tries to organize Jewish law in six large orders, what they call six large sections called orders. And then each order is subdivided into tractates for a total of 63 different tractates on different subjects. And the tractates are divided into chapters, and the chapters are divided into laws. And so it looks like the Talmud is organized, but it's not. It's really, the rabbis did not do a fully structured system, and parts of the Talmud refer to each other, and they get off on tangents, and it's very disorganized. Maimonides was the first Jewish scholar to really systematize Jewish law in a very easy, simple, straightforward way, and that's his Mishneh Torah. So he creates 14 major headings, and each major heading is subdivided into subheadings, and the subheadings are divided into chapters, and the chapters are divided into laws. And it's also beautiful Hebrew, very beautiful, easy Hebrew. Remember, Arabic was his first language, but this is incredibly beautiful, and it's very easily spelled out. First one to totally systematize Jewish law. But he was a philosopher, and so he didn't want to just tell you what the law was. He wanted to give you some philosophy behind it. And so virtually for every section of law, either at the beginning, before he spelled out the rules, or at the end, when he's summarizing it, he gives the philosophy and sort of background belief that sort of explains what this is all about. And so with that in mind, I want to show you this passage here. This is his section on the laws of mourning, right? How do Jews mourn? And it's chapter 13, so it's the last chapter, the last couple of sections, right? He's summarizing the laws of mourning here. So it's at the end, and here he gives you his philosophy about mourning. Why do we mourn, right? If after all, death is part of life, so what is the point of all of these rules regarding mourning? So here he writes, a person should not become excessively brokenhearted because of a person's death, right? If somebody close to you dies, don't be excessively brokenhearted. As Jeremiah 22:10 says, do not weep for a dead man and do not shake your head because of him. It's just a proof text. Some Jews do. We always quote a verse of the Bible to prove a point. That means not to weep excessively. Yeah, you should cry, but don't overly cry. For death is the pattern of the world. In Hebrew, that is, olam noheg kemin hago. Olam, the world, noheg, behaves kemin hago, according to its custom. The world behaves according to its pattern, its custom. It just is, right? That's part of the laws of physics. People die. And a person who causes himself grief because of the pattern of the world is a fool. You can't rail against the laws of physics. They just are. So what do? He's summarizing here what the rule is. You weep for 3 days, you eulogize for 7, you observe the restrictions on cutting your hair for another 30 days, and then mourning. You do the rules of mourning and you mourn appropriately, but not excessively. Now, I always interject here before I go on to the second part that this is what Maimonides says in his rule book. As a matter of fact, when his brother died, his brother was a big international trade person, had ships who were trading back and forth across the Mediterranean, and supported the family on his business. And then his brother died at sea. And the report is that Maimonides was inconsolable about his brother's death for years. So on the one hand, he tells you don't mourn excessively. On the other hand, when it came to himself, he was a human, and he was not able to take his own advice. So for those people who mourn more than the tradition provides, don't feel bad. Even Maimonides did that. But generally speaking, it is good. His advice is well taken. To rail against death is kind of futile. That is part of life. Now let's look at the second halacha. Whoever does not mourn over his dead in the manner which our sages commanded is cruel. If you don't mourn at all, you don't have a heart, right? If you don't experience loss in your life, it's something, you're not in touch with your feelings. Instead, one should be fearful. Okay, so that's the first thing. He says, instead, one should be now fearful, worry, examine his deeds and repent. Where is this coming from, right? If olam noheg kamin hago, the world operates according to its pattern, why are we fearful when somebody dies? Why should we worry? Why examine our deeds and repent? What has that got to do with the person who died? They died because that's the way the world works. And he goes on, if one member of a group dies, the entire group should worry. For the first 3 days, one should see himself as if a sword is drawn over his neck. Death is right on top of you, ready to pounce. From the third day until the seventh day, you should consider as if it's in the corner. The death is just around the corner from you, right? And if you do anything wrong, it's going to come and get you. And from that time onward, it's as if it's passing him in the marketplace, right? It may be hiding in obscurity, but don't get too confident. All of this is so that a person should prepare himself and repent and awake from his sleep, right? And then he gives a proof text. So the teacher who taught me this passage many, many years ago now asked, so Maimonides often does this kind of thing where he poses riddles. He just told you the world operates according to its principles and death is part of life. Now he's telling you to be afraid when someone dies near you that maybe death is coming after you and you should repent. How do those two ideas fit together? And what he suggested was the following. Maimonides, before Freud by several hundred years, was a good psychologist. And it is human nature, when someone close to you dies, to realize your own mortality. And it's human nature then, once you realize your own mortality, to realize since you have a limited time on earth, maybe you ought to change what you're doing. Think about what you're doing in your life now and think, am I doing what's really important? Am I accomplishing something that I really want to accomplish? Am I spending my time in the most effective way I could spend my time? And that's the process of repentance. And that happens just as a matter of human nature. Because when someone close to us dies, we are reminded of human mortality, and we start thinking about these things. And even though that is a normal part of life, Maimonides says, let's take that human instinct and use it for positive good, and repent and try and be better, improve our ways. Maimonides, as we're going to see in the last session, is all about being good, kind of for goodness sake. So be good for goodness sake, as it says in the Christmas song. You should be good for goodness sake, for God's sake, right? And be good, and take any opportunity you can, including the death of someone close to you, to kind of think about how you want to behave. So that's Maimonides. Now let's take a look at, to answer more directly, Daniel's point. So the closing part of my outline here at the top. Okay. So where is God when there's suffering in the world? So, as Harold Kushner says, I think that God is found in our response to suffering, in our response to suffering. Some see tragic consequences of an earthquake as proof there is no God, right? Because how could God let this happen? I see proof that there is a God. Why did we in Houston help each other after Hurricane Harvey? Why did so many people from all over the country and all over the world send aid or come to our help? What do they care what happens to people in Houston? Yet they came here to help us. What motivated them to do that? I firmly believe they did it because they were motivated by God, whether they recognized it or not. They were inspired to go out and be a helping hand to another human being. And anytime anybody goes out to help alleviate suffering in the world, I think they're being inspired by God. So God isn't in the disaster. The disasters happen because of the laws of physics or because of what a human being chose to do because they used their free will in a terrible, terrible way. God is found in the human beings who are inspired to help alleviate the suffering and to provide justice in the world where there's no justice. By the way, I just saw the movie Just Mercy about an African American Harvard Law School graduate who goes to the South to try and provide some justice. Very inspiring movie, right? So yeah, justice is really, really important. But we need to do it. We human beings, right? Why the outpouring of resources support? What motivates people to do this? I think they're inspired by God. In the book of Exodus, God acts in dramatic ways. The plagues, the parting of the sea, we don't see that in our world. But we also learn in the book of Exodus itself that God needs a human catalyst. Even in the book of Exodus. Why did God need to send Moses to talk to Pharaoh? Couldn't God have done it himself? Why did God just say to Pharaoh one day, let my people go? He didn't do that. He had to send Moses. He needed a human catalyst. And I think that's what the Bible is teaching us over and over again. God needs human beings to be the hands and feet of God, as it were, to do those things to provide for a just and compassionate world. And our experience in Egypt taught us to be kind to strangers, right? We learn from our history about how to be better people and how to improve the world. We learn in Leviticus not to stand idly by the blood of our neighbor and to love our neighbor as ourselves. God is teaching us to do what she cannot do, because if God did it, it would violate the laws of physics. But if we do it as human beings, operating within the laws of physics, we can be God's hands and feet to make the world a better place. We can alleviate the suffering and promote justice. So I think that's what he created human beings to do. It goes back to those two stories of creation at the beginning of the class, right? The first story is about how God created a world that operates according to the laws of physics, that has systematic, and it isn't good or bad. It just is. But it's because it's structured, because it operates according to rules, we can use our brains to figure out what those rules are and understand better how it works. But it also necessarily creates problems. It will create problems of suffering. And God wanted to create a creature who could think for itself, learn about how the system works, and then has free will to use our wisdom to help and fix and solve those problems. I think that's my reading of the Bible, is that God created human beings to fix those problems. And unfortunately, God didn't realize how often we would screw up, how often we'd make mistakes, how often we'd cause more suffering than alleviate suffering. But the rest of the Bible is all about God trying to train us to be better in various ways. And I think God continues to inspire us to try and do better. Right? And clearly, in the opening chapters of Genesis, He put human beings in charge of the planet, and we now rule the planet definitively, absolutely, and completely. We rule this planet, but now we have the responsibility to rule the planet with compassion and kindness and justice and fairness. And that's what the Bible is trying to teach us to do. So it's not about um, God causing evil in the world. It's about God charging us as humans to ameliorate the evil, to limit the evil, and to provide more goodness in the world. That's my answer to the problem of evil. Okay, questions? No comments? Hey, Max? Hey, Max? Any
Okay, I'll
comments?
make one comment, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Um, the statement you made that God didn't realize how much we would mess up, how does that square with the fact that he's all knowing?
He's supposed to be all knowing, yeah. Um, okay, so first of all, we use language to try and explain God, and that's not easy in the first place because our language is, we normally use language to explain things we can see, touch, taste, smell, and hear, and God is none of those. So our language is kind of limited. So I'm just trying to put into human words an idea that's not easy to explain. Um, but the Bible does seem to indicate that, right? First of all, I would just point out, before the flood in the story of Noah, God says, "Wow, he was really." It says he was really disappointed. He was appalled at the destruction of that humanity was causing, and that's why he did the flood. Well, how could he be appalled if he knew what was going to happen? Why would he? He regrets. He said he regretted that he created. I mean, it says that in the Bible. How could he regret? Didn't he know what was going to happen? So I think this is an attempt to um, look. If you see that God is sort of the force in the universe that created life and that created sentient life in the universe, the purpose of the project was to create this ideal world. But this sentient being is not doing a very good job. So God is very patient and is trying to constantly inspire and improve the way this sentient being, right, the human beings, operate on the planet, right? And it's up to us to listen to the message and to act on it. And He's going to keep trying with us, you know. He's constantly trying, and we have to just kind of get better at it.
Okay, so we could say he knows we're going to mess up, but he's still disappointed.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, He knows that He created imperfect creatures, right? That's also a Jewish belief, and so therefore He is compassionate. And when we try to fix what we did wrong, He forgives us. We totally believe that. Um, yeah, but I think the Bible seems to indicate that God was very disappointed with the world. I mean, with human beings, and He's trying different experiments. He gets Noah, who's the best human being that he can find, and he starts all over again. That doesn't go so well, and people start to build a Tower of Babel. So he's okay. I'm going to separate people out into different cultures, and they'll start exploring the world on their own. And when they interact with each other, that will cause them to gain new insights about how the world really works, right? They have to, and this is one of the things we're struggling with now because we're almost like back with the Tower of Babel in the internet. We can now congregate with only like-minded people and never have to interact with anybody who disagrees with us. So we don't really grow our capacity to understand the world because we're just an echo chamber, right? That was the problem with, I think, one of the problems with the Tower of Babel. Everybody was all together in this thing and they weren't really getting it. So he's okay, I'm going to scatter you out. You'll develop different ways of thinking, and now the interaction, you will come to understand the world better. Okay, so he tried that. That didn't work so well. So then he gets Abraham, one person. He says, "I'm gonna train this guy to think and to reason and to try and be moral." Okay, so that you can see that that family was also had its problems, right? So then with the Exodus from Egypt, he says, okay, I'm going to try a new experiment. I'm going to start with a nation, a group of people, a large group of people. I can give them laws. I'm going to give them rules, which will be just and fair and compassionate. And we'll see how that works. And then the rest of the Bible is about how that didn't work so well either, because we weren't always following the rules. Um, right? So God is constantly trying to fix things and make things better. And actually, if you look at the arc of history, so to speak, right, it does bend toward justice eventually, right? I think we are now much, much better than humanity was 200, 300 years ago, but we still have lots of problems to fix, right? And so we're getting there. Darlene is writing that in the book of Job gives a semi-satisfactory answer. God tells Job's friends that Job was righteous and didn't deserve what happened to him. In other words, this world isn't meant to be perfect. Yes, right. I think that's, I read, Darlene, I read exactly the same way. I read the book of Job the same way. Um, Job, at the end of the book of Job, God finally appears to give the answer to Job. Why did you suffer? And his answer is basically, where were you when I created the world? Do you understand anything about mountains and earthquakes and storms and floods? You don't know anything about physics. Go learn something before you talk to me. All right. Um, I think that's the answer. It's like I think Job, in a way, is saying again, the book of Job is saying to human beings again, look, you need to figure out how the world works and fix it. And fix it in the moral sense. You know, it works beautifully according to the laws of physics, but there's still a lot of suffering in the world. So that's us. That's our job to fix. The world isn't supposed to be perfect. I think that's how I read the book of Job. Also,
Rabbi, can I comment?
sure.
So I was thinking how a lot of things in nature kind of just, when something goes wrong, it overcorrects, it corrects itself in one way or another. So
Right.
um, one thing I like to think about is there's this whole plant species in South Africa that it only thrives on fire. Like that's the way it spreads its seed, is when there are huge bushfires. So it looks like this really terrible, tragic event, but in some way or another, there's actually harmony
Right.
being like in some way.
Right.
That's the goal. There's like a teleological
Yes.
something at the end of this. And so maybe it's in a similar way, humans are somewhat more complex than animals and plants and rocks and earthquakes, because we were given intention, right? And
Yes.
so maybe we're also just like nature trying to reach that point of harmony in some way or another, but because we have intention, it's going to be a lot longer until we get there, because of, like you say, the Tower of Babel, and just because of the free will, right? Because it's going to take a really long time before everyone in the world comes to the very same point of harmony,
Right.
if ever, right?
What's interesting about the world right now, I think, is that because of the internet, um, if we get out of our own silos, we are able to connect with people all over the world. I mean, we have tremendous potential now, I think, for the first time in human existence, at least for the couple thousand years, to be able to get together and focus on common problems and fix them. And we just need to all be rowing in the right direction together, you know? So um, while we're being, a lot of things are being thrown at us in the last few months and couple of years, there's also an opportunity here for humanity to coalesce and to come together and to start solving some of these big problems. And hopefully that's the direction we'll go. but I agree with your thinking there, actually. Yeah. I guess I'm overtime. Uh, so, oh, oh, you got the episode of Star Trek. Oh, that's good. This Side of Paradise. Yes, thank you very much. That's the one. This Side of Paradise, season 1, episode 24. Check it out. Anyways, next week we're going to look at the afterlife and the different Jewish views of that, and then the final one will be Maimonides. Yeah, Max. Oh, Max, I can't hear you somehow. We can't hear you, Max. Oh, shoot. Okay. Well, we'll come back next time. I'll text Max and let him know that he can text me and let us know what's going on. Okay. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi Morgan.
Thank you.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Rabbi.